Hey guys, appreciate y'all taking the time to watch this video. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do so. If you like this video, hit the like button. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them down below. You know what to do. And so I'm going to get into this here. When I talk to people about eschatology, one of the common topics that comes up naturally is the promises made to Abraham. And particularly one of the promises I hear is the land promise that was made to Abram. And some people have the idea that Israel to this day, the physical lineage of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, is still waiting to receive a promise of land over on the east side of Mediterranean Sea, that there's some land over there, some dirt and trees and rocks over there and rivers that are supposed to belong to them, and they are waiting to receive that. I want to look into the text of Scripture today and see if the Bible talks about that land promise ever being completed, ever being fulfilled, if Israel had ever possessed that land that was promised to Abram, to the fathers. So Genesis chapter 12, we'll start right here. You remember in the text of Genesis 12, this is where we initially see God promising to Abram, telling him to leave his land, that he would make of Abram a great nation, make his name great, bless those who blessed Abram, curse those who cursed Abram, and in Abram and you, Abram, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. You come down to Genesis 12:7. The text there goes on to say, the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your descendants I will give this land. And there he built an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. So here we see God telling Abram, I will be giving you this land. I will give this land rather. And so the text right there, we see right away, God telling Abram, there's some land coming to you. Genesis 13:18 or 13:15 rather, and Genesis 17:8 also mention this. We're going to go over to Genesis 15 and look at verse 18 and see what God says there. On the same day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, what? To your descendants I have given this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates. The river of Egypt, by the way, is not the Nile River. The Nile River is actually inside of Egypt. If they were to have land up to the Nile River, that means they would be taking part of Egypt away. That wasn't part of the promise. They weren't going to go possess part of the land of Egypt. The river of Egypt is a river, I believe it's called the Wadi El Arish. It's on the northeast side of the Sinai Peninsula. That would be the lower border of the land promised to Abram. That's the river of Egypt. The great river, the river Euphrates, would be the northeast boundaries up on the upper side. 10 nations here stated by God as those nations that were currently dwelling in the land, those peoples that were currently dwelling, those kingdoms that were currently dwelling in the land at the time the promise was made. When Israel was going to be receiving that promise, when they were going to take the land, God made it point to them that they were not going to be taking the land at one time. Notice this. This is in Exodus chapter 23. Recall now, Abram's long gone. Now we are in the wilderness. Israel has been drawn out of Egypt. God led them out, and Moses here at Mount Sinai is receiving, revelation from God. God's communicating with him. God tells them that I'll send an angel before you to keep you in the way and to bring you into the place which I have prepared. That's the land that they will be going to. Exodus 23 and verse 30. Notice this in verse 29. We'll look at that. I will not drive them out from before you. God telling Moses that he would not be driving out the inhabitants of the land before Israel in 1 year. The reason being, lest the land become desolate and the beasts of the field become too numerous for you. Recall in Deuteronomy chapter 7, Israel was not the mightiest nation. They were the smaller nation. They were a weaker nation. And because of that, if the land was completely desolate and all the inhabitants driven out and they had all this land now for this small nation that had to grow and develop still, all that empty, desolate land would be opportunity for the animals, the beasts of the field, as it says right here, to become too numerous. And that would cause problems for Israel. So God's saying we're going to do this little by little. As he says in verse 30, little by little, I will drive them out from before you until you have increased and you inherit the land. Okay. Now, and God goes on to say in verse 31, by the way, I will set your bounds from the Red Sea to the sea, Philistia, and from the desert to the river. I will deliver the inhabitants of the land into your land, and you shall drive them out before you. And so that being said, let's look at a text now that tells us that Israel, in fact, received the land that was promised to them. Joshua chapter 1, if I can get there. They're about to go in the land now. God's talking to Joshua. Moses, my servant, is dead. Now, therefore, arise, go over this Jordan, and you and all this people, that is Israel, to the land which I am giving to them, the children of Israel. Every place that the sole of your foot will tread upon, I have given you, as I said to Moses, from the wilderness and this Lebanon, as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, and all the land of the Hittites, and to the great sea toward the going down of the sun, shall be your territory. God now telling Joshua, we're about to go into the land. This land where you're going to go is going to be your land. Where you tread your foot, that will be your land. You come to the end of Joshua now, folks. I want you to read this closely, because this basically lays it to rest. I really don't see what the problem is when people look at this text. And we're going to look at this here, and we'll see exactly how much land and how much of the promise to Abram for the land that was going to be given to Abram, how much of it was fulfilled. Joshua 21, verse 43. The text says, watch this closely, y'all. So the Lord gave to Israel. So God gave to Israel what? All the land. God gave to Israel all the land of which he had sworn to give to their fathers. So this is not talking about some other description of land that was apart from what Abram was told, or what God told Abram. This is saying God gave to Israel all the land of which he swore to give to who? To their fathers. This is the promise of the fathers. We're seeing this right now. And God's saying the Lord gave all of it, all of the land to Israel. The land, which land? The land that he swore to give to their fathers. But look what it says also. And they took possession of it and dwelt in it. Don't tell me that Israel's never possessed the land that God promised to Abram. It text says right here, God gave to Israel all that land that he promised to give to their fathers, and they took possession of it. Moreover, look what it says in the next passage here, the next text, or next section of the text. The Lord gave them rest all around according to all that he had sworn to their fathers. Hello? All that he had sworn to give to their fathers. And not a man of all their enemies stood against them. In other words, it wasn't like they just went into the land. They were like hiding in caves and trees and under wooded areas, and the people of the lands were still ruling and dominating over them, and Israel was just surviving in the land. No, they had control over those peoples in the land, the Girgashites, the Hittites, and all those other nations of the lands, or the peoples rather, that were in the land. Israel had control over them. They had power over them, so that not a man of all their enemies stood against them. The Lord, it says, delivered all their enemies into their hand. And look at the final passage in Joshua 21 here, the final verse. Not a word failed of any good thing which the Lord had spoken to the house of Israel. All came to pass. Folks, if this doesn't tell you that Israel had received all the land and possessed all the land and dwelt in all the land that God swore to the fathers, if that doesn't mean that what God told Abram that his descendants would inherit or inhabit, I don't know what else to tell you, folks. I really don't know what to say, because if you look at that, what it says, there's no way of getting around that explicitly says that they received the land that God promised to the fathers, and that would be Abram and Isaac and Jacob. Let's look at a couple other passages here real quick. 1 Kings chapter 4. This is talking about King Solomon. I want you to see how much of the land and see where King Solomon had rule. 1 Kings 4:21. So Solomon reigned over all kingdoms. Look at that. He reigned over all kingdoms from the river to the land of the Philistines as far as the border of Egypt. That's talking about where we were earlier. The river of Egypt on the northeast side of Mount Sinai. Check that out. But anyways, you see here, though, Solomon reigned over all kingdoms. That's sovereignty. He had rule over all the kingdoms that were in that land, in that region. From the river to the land of the Philistines as far as the border of Egypt, they brought tribute and served Solomon all the days of his life. When other people are ruling over you, and they have power separate and independent from you, they don't come bring tribute to you and serve you all the days of your life. No, that means he was the king. He had rule over all those kingdoms. Look at 2 Chronicles chapter 9. Same thing. 2 Chronicles chapter 9. Look at verse 26. speaking of Solomon, so he reigned over all the kings from the river to the land of the Philistines as far as the border of Egypt. There we go. Solomon had rule. He had power. Remember, God said little by little, incrementally, they would take the land. That's right. The land was theirs. They had the land. Over time, they would inhabit it more and more and drive out the people more and more. Part of the reason why it was a delay was because of Israel's stubbornness, their unfaithfulness to God, their desire to fraternize with these surrounding nations, these heathen lands, and to actually engage with them in their idolatry and things of that nature. But we see, though, nonetheless, that in the days of Solomon, he reigned over all the kings, all the kingdoms. So there's no doubt that they had control. And I'm going to leave you with this last passage here in Nehemiah, folks. And I think we pretty much have, I really don't know what else needs to be said at this point. But look at Nehemiah chapter 9 and look at verse 7. You are the Lord God who chose Abram and brought him out of Ur of the Chaldeans and gave him the name Abraham. You found his heart faithful before you and made a covenant with him to give the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Jebusites, and the Girgashites, to give it to his descendants. You made that covenant to give that land to his descendants. Well, what about that? What about that covenant? You have performed your words. You have performed your words. Again, another mention, skipping over anybody in the process, going back to Abraham, back to the fathers, back to the covenant that was made with them. And it says of that covenant, which covenant? The one to give the land to his descendants. You have performed your words. So, folks, if folks want to still continue to deny, let them. But the Bible is going to stand and militate against any commentary, any claims that Israel today has never received the promised land as was promised to Abram. It says it right there in the text. We've seen Joshua 21, 1 Kings 4, 2 Chronicles 9. So we see here Nehemiah 9. And there are many other passages. I just don't want to drag this video out and just go through over and over and over again. But I think we've made the point. I think we've made the point abundantly clear. They got that promise as it was given to the fathers. There is no promise of the land that is waiting for Israel today. They got their promise and they have served their purpose. Thank you all for watching this video. Again, if you have any comments or questions, leave them down below and I will see you guys on the next one. Take care.